in Ontario is preparing for a strike vote after months of stalled negotiations with the Ford government has led to a lack of significant process. And we know that other teachers' unions have expressed similar frustration with the Ford government. And, coming out of the pandemic, especially, our children deserve a government that's going to invest in their education. And I just want to remind folks that, I was on the picket lines with educators prior to the pandemic, and thank goodness teachers and educators stood up to the Ford government's efforts to mandate online learning and to significantly increase class sizes right before the pandemic. And I just want to thank educators for pushing back successfully against that, because I think we all learned from the pandemic that mandatory online learning is not something that we want in our schools. I mean, having it as an option, absolutely, but mandatory online learning, I think we all agree, is something we don't want. And thank goodness educators fought for lower class sizes, because I think the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of lower class sizes. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation today. And I want to begin actually by just asking Matt and Aislinn, if you could tell us a bit about your background in education, because both of you work in schools from different perspectives. And I think both of you bring a really important perspective to this conversation. So if you could talk a little bit about your background in education and what it's been like being an educator during the last 5 years of the Ford government. And Matt, since you're the senior person in that regard, I'll begin with you and then ask Aislinn to provide her perspective.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome and good afternoon, everyone. My teaching background and my interest in education has been since 1998, when I first landed a job in Trillium Lakeland District School Board. And it was just at the end of the Harris regime, with quite a few issues at that time that were causing teachers and staff, like just all education staff, parents, community, a lot of angst and anger at that time. And sometimes you think there's no way it could get worse. And here we are 25 years later, and the disrespect and the lack of any genuine listening and collaboration with teachers, education staff, with parents and students, it's always been missing with conservative governments, and Ford just continues to be this way. One interesting background that I had was when I was entering education, principals were part of the teachers union, and many principals and teachers alike will say that it was a mistake to bring the principals out of the teachers union, and it's created a divide. It's worked to an extent over the years as people sort their differences and what the different job titles are. However, it was more collaborative and a cohesive effort when all staff were together on the same page. And then, the one thing, and then Aislinn, I'll let you take over after this point. As an educator, since 1998 right through till this year, I have always been in the junior grade range, or junior intermediate for elementary, which is grade 4 to 8. And we seem to be in this forgotten territory of where class sizes need to be to make it meaningful and just doable. And we've never had a strong cap. So it's interesting how numbers get played around. Yes, the primary grades have had smaller class sizes, but in grade 4 to 8, they float this word averages around. And Stephen Lecce and Doug Ford like to play up a big game with what they've done with class sizes. But I can tell you this year, my class had 32 students for most of the year, and then it dropped down to 31, but without any supports. And I'm not complaining, like as a teacher, specifically as a teacher, about demands that are required, but it's not sustainable. And the class sizes that have been reduced in other areas of education, that's been wonderful, but I think the general public needs to be mindful that when they float the word averages or class size averages around, that's just an average. So literally from grade 4 to 8, we've had classes in Trillium Lakeland, and I've heard throughout Ontario, different boards, we've had classes well over 35 students. So it's a little deceiving when they mention some of those stats, and it's not getting any better until until we bring some meaningful policy change to get those class sizes in check. But I'll leave it at that, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Hi, I'm Aislinn. I've been a school social worker for 11 years. I worked in the public board and the Catholic board. What I've noticed of late, I used to have a lot more schools. I went from working in one high school and 5 elementary. It was very, very busy. And then working in the elementary schools, and more recently with students who dropped out. So we know that the kids, many have not bounced back, and there's been a heavy impact from the COVID pandemic years on students and their progress through the education system. So really a lot of in-depth experience with the barriers that students are facing in being successful in schools and what's led them to stop attending. And I think one thing that we hasn't really been discussed sometimes, and anecdotally, our team has noticed a real spike in attendance concerns. So when kids are feeling overcrowded in their classrooms, or they're not getting the supports they need at school, or they don't feel an emotional connection to their teacher, sometimes that leads them to battling their caregiver to come to school. So I see a few areas in which that's exacerbated. One, we know that mental health issues facing young people these days are at an all-time high. And there's many reasons why that is the case, but we don't see the same investment in our local mental health services. The provinces, there's a huge gap, especially I've noticed it in our emergency rooms, that we are having a hard time finding mental health care, even the most acute, for students. And so all those things, and undermining of the supports for students with autism, we know there's 50,000 students on the list. All those things end up becoming where the schools meet those needs. So we see an increased demand in the needs that students bring to school because they're not met in the community, and that lands on in a classroom setting where we see increases in behaviors, mental health issues, and that shows up in kids' ability to attend school and to learn.
Sorry, can you all hear me?
Perhaps while we're waiting,
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some technical problems.
If I may just pick up on what Aislinn was saying, that there was, just from a personal experience this year, to talk about wait lists, and it is so exacerbating as in terms of the challenges that we have for students getting the time and getting the attention they deserve to get the supports. We've had students waiting for just basic auditory hearing checks and assessments, for some just basic requirements to ensure that their learning potential is there. And it can be up to 1 to 2 years just for those assessments, let alone psych ed assessments or further that more complex issues. So, you know, it's just when you see what's on the ground with the frontline workers in education, it's almost unbelievable when you talk to people in the general public until they actually get an opportunity to come into the schools and see it for themselves.
Yeah, thanks for cutting in there, Matt. My internet stopped for a second, so I don't know what's happening here in Guelph. But thank you. So Yeah, I just want to emphasize what both of you said, that I'm having more and more parents in particular come into my office, expressing significant concerns about lack of resources and services, especially for children with special needs, and how that's affecting their education. We know that earlier this week, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario announced that they'll be holding a strike vote in September and October. And other unions have also just expressed significant frustration with the fact that educators have been without a contract for a year now, and trying to negotiate with the Ford government. And I'm just curious what the two of you think has led to us getting to this point of just stalled and frustrated negotiations. And Aislinn, maybe you can start this time.
I'm worried because we've seen how things have played out in healthcare, that there's a real keenness to privatize parts of our healthcare system. I see the same happening in education with the move to online learning, and the disregard for unions and collective bargaining, right? I think teachers want to be treated with respect. They want, and education workers want to be treated with respect. I know I was out on the picket lines with CUPE when they were faced with this back to work legislation, like the heavy-handedness that I think they seek out, and I think it undermines the quality of work, that people feeling heard, the collaboration as a municipal city councillor. I've seen how there's very little conversation, very little feedback, and you just get told this is what you get, right? So just complete undermining of the relationship between the government and unions, and the idea of labor. And I think that the real outcome they're looking for is a way to undermine the system so that they can move folks into a private system and find ways to treat our education system like a business, not looking at students and staff as investments in the future of Ontario.
Yeah, Matt, what's your perspective?
As a teacher, and carrying on from Aislinn, as a teacher, I often get concerned about what the optics will be amongst the public who aren't involved in education. So often when strike votes come up, I would say that the general public looks to teachers with a bit of disdain, and there's frustration among some of the general public in the past during strike votes that put it to the fault of the teachers or the education workers during last year's potential and some of the job action last year. And I think that has changed, though. I'm seeing more, not all, but I'm seeing much more percentages of people throughout Ontario that do support education workers and the right to strike. And they're seeing beyond just the surface level and recognizing that this is the doing of the Ford government. 5 years they've now had to reverse the problems that have been persisting over the years from other governments too, from the Liberal government, I'd have to add in. And for one very specific example, it's the lack of safety that students and staff feel in the schools, and the students who need those supports, the most vulnerable students in our society at our schools, they're just simply not getting the support that they deserve, that they require. And in fact, it's being reduced. I'll give a quick example up here in our board. There's a town of Gravenhurst. Gravenhurst High School has just over 300 students, not a huge high school, but the number of education assistants at that high school is two educational assistants. And back in the day, there was a time that high schools and elementary schools had there were different options, and some students went to different schools, and we all agreed that inclusion is a better model where we have all students learning under one roof, but that has to be supported. And when it isn't, it leads to massive problems, massive challenges, burnout among teachers, education staff, parents are frustrated, students get nervous and scared, and anxiety rises. And the Ford government just hasn't been listening to common sense on this one, and it's beyond frustrating. So I am hoping that this strike vote is simply a reflection of what needs to happen, and the public sees it that way, that Ford has to start, or Lecce, the government, they have to start making the necessary investments in student mental health, student well-being, and until that happens, this is going to be the result.
Yeah, you both raise, especially Matt, on the safety issue. I know a few months ago, a report came out just talking about safety concerns in schools. And that's something I've been hearing from educators for a long time now. And in some cases, I know educators are told, wear Kevlar to help protect you. And I remember saying that on a radio show, and the host was just like, "You're kidding me. Like, you can't be true what you're saying. Don't be so hyperbolic." And I'm like, no, literally, this is what educators are telling me. And I don't think the public realizes just the challenging working conditions that so many educators are facing each and every day. And so I know safety concerns have been a big issue that educators have been raising. Class sizes obviously is a huge one, and just working conditions in general in our schools. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about your own experience working in schools as it relates to working conditions, and just how that affects the learning experience that children have in our schools. And maybe Aislinn, you can start this time.
Yeah, I think as a re-engagement social worker that I was for the last few years, the key way to help students feel welcome in schools is a connection with an adult in the building. So anytime you've taken a teacher and you split their time 31 ways in terms of Matt's classroom, that's less time that teacher can spend with that student. Every student's different. They all have a different need. But I know, staff that I have in my family and friends have said, when they don't have a relationship with me, maybe they miss a lot of school. When they come back, they need my attention and they need my help to get reconnected to the class, to what's happening in the class. So that relationship is number one. I think if you look at any study, if you give your heart to your educator, you learn really well. And when we split an educator and education staff workers' time, and that goes for child and youth workers and EAs, the more we divvy up that time, spread thin across a great number of students, kids feel less connected to the adults in the building, and it makes it really challenging for them to get what they need. So I do see it, I call it the lid. Kids can regulate really well when they're in a quieter room, where they have enough space to move around. You try to fit 31 desks into a room. It's just noise-wise. The noise is up, stress levels are up, kids can't move around, and it just means they have less time to spend in an individualized way. And we think of reading. I mean, this government has talked about reading. I met a lot of students who stopped going because they really didn't feel like they could do well, like they weren't feeling successful, because for years we've undermined the one-to-one and small group reading programs that we have in the early grades. So here we've had this report on learn to read, and they picked out this reading assessment tool. That's one of the only tools in the toolbox that they say we need to bring in. They've missed the boat on all the beautiful stuff that we know works really well. Small group reading, one-to-one, and that helps kids feel successful. So when they hit the grades where they need to be more independent, like high school and intermediate, and when those class sizes are bigger, they have that tool in their toolbox to feel successful. So when we undermine their early years in feeling good as a reader, and then we shove them in a super crowded class in a high school that some of these high schools are enormous. I have one in our board, St. Mary's, it's 2,300 students, right? So these huge, very crowded spaces where you really need to be independent. I mean, the more we undermine the tools in the toolbox and the relationships, the more I see kids feeling unsuccessful and a lack of connection to schools.
And I'll carry on with that lack of connection that sometimes that we see happening all too frequently in schools. And in my own personal experience, there are days where it's very frustrating that we see some of the vulnerable students, the students with special needs, students who have different learning challenges, that they struggle to find that connection, that trust, and that sense of comfort in schools. Not all the time, but frequently, because their strengths aren't being celebrated. We know that language and numeracy is so important, but it's at the cost of all what feels like all other aspects of the school day. And some of the other subject areas are basic luxuries, it seems sometimes. And those could be the subject areas that those students succeed at, but we don't see them being celebrated. We need that. We also need to see, like what I consistently see with students who require an educational assistant, if they have one, we see a massive turnover of educational assistants because of the working conditions, because of the lack of job security. And what do students with special needs need most? It's consistency. They need to build up that relationship and that trust with the educational assistant. 2 years ago, and most recently this past year, but 2 years ago, I had 8 different EAs come through my class, not because they didn't like working with me, but no, it's frightening, but 8 different EAs, because they were being pulled in all different directions, times where teachers weren't able to show up, so they had to fill in different gaps, and just too many demands. So 8 different EAs in 1 year for a student that in their profile requires consistency. Like that's one of the requirements in their individual education plan. So it smacks of hypocrisy when we know what to do, but we're funded in a way that can't even come close to achieving that. And the importance of the educational assistance, it cannot be overestimated. And it comes down to often that they're feeling burnt out and just not respected with what they need. And it comes down to finances. I had an EA at my school, and in our board, after 20 years, they just received a pay increase, and that brought them up to just under $21 an hour. Now, I know EAs get paid differently across Ontario and, in a fluctuating scale, but in our board, $21 an hour for the work that an educational assistant does, it's tricky, and that's after 20 years. So lots of challenges that can still be brought forward, but it's those are the day in and day out challenges that we see when it comes to honoring what students with special needs really do require.
Yeah, so you're both parents as well as educators. And Matt, I'm just curious, like what are your kids talking to you about in regards to their experience in school and what they need and what, in your perspective as a parent?
Mm-hmm. So my youngest is still in elementary school, and we're fortunate that we live in a community where there's a forest at the school. So they do get outdoor learning opportunities, and depending on where the teacher's comfort level is at. So we celebrate that with our youngest, and he needs that. And I would say all students need that outdoor learning consistent outdoor learning opportunity. The number one frustration with my son, though, is the lunchtime routine, or the nutrition break routine. Because of staffing and just numbers, it's usually one adult who monitors 3 or 4 different classrooms during nutrition break time. And so the level of noise when the teacher's not there, it's an official unsupervised time. And I've heard this across Ontario and other school boards too, where students don't walk home nutrition breaks are so, even if you could walk home, you're not going to get much time, depending on how the school board does things. But because of that monitoring, that on its own creates so much stress and anxiety. There are times where I'll hear other students that it's not that they fear going to school, but they get anxious because they know how loud it gets when there's no teacher supervision or adult supervision of any kind. So that's what I'm seeing. I don't want to end it on a negative there before I hand it off to Aislinn, but I think that's a really important one. And on behalf of the students in elementary, they would like me to give a shout out to that key issue that they find.
Yeah, yeah. I have a student in junior public and a student, my daughter's in senior public. I think she's loved middle school because of those specialized teachers that I know. I have a friend who's a teacher said, they're not, I know French immersion, for example, they won't get a music teacher who's, has that. Yeah. So I think she's really connected well in middle school because she has an art teacher who's an artist. They have musicians, a music teacher who's a musician. So I see these as the things that are lighting her up that I hear of other settings and other parts of the school system where it's not possible. We have major shortages of staffing, the ability to fill teacher spots. So I know, she's been lucky to have some extra support in one area, and she's found herself fitting in well at middle school. But she does talk about students in grade 7 that aren't coming to school, and kids who are struggling with behaviors and mental health, and just worried about those peers of hers. My youngest, he shares about what we've talked about, like kids in the room, and sometimes himself included, where he needs a little bit of a help with how he's feeling, and it's just hard for the teacher to give that attention to students because they're pulled in a million directions. And so it can be a negative experience if you're having an upset moment. As kids who are internalizers might withdraw, kids who are externalizers might act out, and the stress shows up in different ways. And so he loves to learn, but I think he needs help with his feelings sometimes, and really lets me know, and it shows up when he can't get any support when he needs it to cope with some of the stressors at school. But he's also in an inner city school where they don't have a yard. He has to walk to a yard across a very busy area. So we densely populate the downtown, which I'm really grateful for, but we also need to make sure we have the infrastructure and the green space. And I know that's something that the Ford government is attacking, is green space for students. So a lot of our inner city schools, the playground gets covered in portables. And I really, and then kids are smushed up against each other, right? They need that time to run around, to let off steam, to be in nature, to be physical, to release any sort of energy. And I know that in our inner city schools, that's in jeopardy because there's crowding. So, that's just something that comes up a lot at our school, our downtown school. I'm grateful he can walk back and forth and he can get to school. He's close by, but I know that space is an issue, green space, especially in our downtown.
Yeah, thanks for that. I am wondering, maybe both your educator, your politician, and your parent hat on now. What would be, Aislinn, for you, what would be the most important thing you think the government could do to address the concerns that educators have, parents have, and students have in terms of how we can improve our schools?
I wish this government would listen. I think they aren't educators. They don't have the expertise in this area. They all have different experiences with schools. And I think educators want to feel like they're valued, that their career, their experience, their education, all the wisdom they have about kids. Educators want to be with kids, love kids, and spend time with them and see them thrive. And I think we don't hear that from the government. They don't talk about education staff like they matter, like they have expertise. And that shows up by not even showing up to the table. And that I think, that puts an edge. When you're going back in September, it's already a time where you're full of anxiety, you're setting up your classroom, or you're getting ready for a new routine and new students that have different needs. And to have a government that doesn't acknowledge and value your expertise and listen to what you see can help students, and listen to what educators need to feel like they have a safe and healthy workplace. That's what I wish the Ford government would do, is just have that respectful attitude, and that we feel like they see children as the future of Ontario, that if we invest money, it's not an expense, it's an investment, that students can thrive, they can feel belonging, and they can have their needs met. That's what I hope the government will do. Of course, I want them to fund mental health care, fund students with autism for their behavioral needs, make sure class sizes aren't unreasonable, there's a cap, and make sure that we fund things. There's a lot of demands being made about assessing for reading and doing new math stuff, doing equity work, but that has to come with training, tools, and staffing dollars. So a lot of these demands don't get properly resourced. It's a, by the way, here you go, figure it out. And I just wish that they would listen and collaborate, and that we can move forward for the well-being of our students.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, going on, Aislinn, when you commented there about the assessments and just how much focus comes back to language and math assessments, I would love to see the Ford government, obviously, and any government, obviously still continue to promote literacy and numeracy. That's an obvious, but not at the expense of the well-being of the students. And on behalf of principals who shared this with me at a conference last year during the election, they said, but Matt, what can we do? We are mandated, like we are so driven by the government to ensure that test scores go up, that for literacy numeracy, that anytime we have professional development days or training opportunities, most of it, not all, but most of that time is dedicated to looking at data, looking at analysis of math and language. And it doesn't matter if a teacher is 5 years into their career or 20 years into the career, they're doing the same thing, is what it appears at these training sessions and PD sessions, of just constantly looking at data, looking at ways of driving up test scores. And what we've heard from in our school and school board and across Ontario are educators all saying how much more appropriate and effective it would be to spend that time of training days and PD days to look at classroom management strategies, behavior management strategies. What's working well? How do we team build and build a community of learners here that are honored and feel safe at school? And it's not to say that some schools don't do that at selective times, but it sure isn't the priority. To me, to just redirect some of that focus and the funding that's already there, take a bit of the edge off of the literacy and numeracy, and put some more and allocate and advocate for allocate the funding and the time, but then advocate for schools that have consistent check-ins with the staff, with all staff, with students and parents, to make sure people are feeling safe and being happy at school. It seems like such a simple thing of what I'm trying to get at here, but it doesn't happen. And I think that choice on its own could be a very cost-effective approach that would lead to more student safety at school.
Yeah, one of the things I hear both of you saying, and it's something I've been saying a lot when it comes to healthcare workers, is that we have to care for the people who care for our loved ones if they're going to receive the care they need. And I feel it's the same way with students. If you're going to disrespect nurses, you're going to see challenges in our healthcare system. If you disrespect educators, you're going to see challenges in our education system. And that seems to be a consistent theme across all public services in Ontario right now under this government. I want to give each of you, before we bring Cecilia in to share some audience questions, one to give you, and Matt, I'll start with you. Like, if there's just one quick takeaway message that you want to leave the audience with, I want to give you the opportunity to deliver that now.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for that opportunity to share this. I would say, if it's not too much to ask for people listening in and attending today, to go out and have a coffee or a sit-down chat with an education worker, a teacher, EA, custodian, secretary, whoever it might be. But just, if you could get 5 minutes, because I know it's very difficult to get into the schools to actually see what's going on unless it's an assembly where everybody's putting on their best face anyhow, but to actually get to the nitty gritty of what goes into a day of work or what goes into a day in the life of a student and staff at schools. If you could give 5 minutes to have a really uninterrupted and very focused conversation with somebody and just really hear what they have to say, that would be I think that would be a great start, especially as we go into strike action, to really get to empathize and understand what the issues are that people who work in schools day in and day out see.
I would say two things. I guess one, get involved. You know, we have a by-election here in Kitchener, and it's an opportunity to send a strong voice, mine, to Queen's Park going into this year. Having an education worker, a school social worker at Queen's Park, I think would be super valuable, but you have to get involved, right? Like, we need a village to tackle this issue. I hope people will also look past some of the numbers we get from the Ford government. I think the numbers are misleading. They're not marked to inflation. They don't help people understand the scope of the education system, the capital expenses that we're spending. And so the numbers are really misleading. And I hope people can look critically at what you're being told, because I think we've seen in the Green Belt, we've seen in healthcare how they create a crisis and then they use it to do what they want to do, which really means making private sector wealthy folks richer. So I hope people will see that this is happening here and look critically at some of the numbers that the Ford government's putting forward and get involved. Come to come to Park in Victoria and knock on some doors.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And Cecilia, I just wanted to ask you if you can share any questions that our audience might have.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple questions. We'll start off with, how will all three of you push back on the government and call them to account for not supporting students and staff properly? So maybe I'll go to you, Mike.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to continue to be a strong voice at Queen's Park. Most people have said that I punch well above our weight at Queen's Park, and we can double that by electing Aislinn to be the second Green MPP in Ontario history. We came very close with Matt and Parry Sound-Muskoka in the last election, because then we can double our impact. And I've always told educators I'm hoping the Ford government will actually negotiate in good faith, and we're going to avoid any job action. I'm increasingly becoming worried that that's not going to be the case, given the way the government has failed to negotiate in good faith. But I've always told education workers that don't hesitate to, have job action in front of my constituency office. You're always welcome. And also, if it comes to it, I'll be out on the picket line supporting you, because I know that your job action is to support students. And at the end of the day, it's about our children. It's about their education. It's about their future, and ensuring that we've made the investments that our kids need to thrive as learners, and to have their mental well-being cared for, and just to stand there and be there with you in solidarity to amplify your voices to support our children and families. Aislinn, why don't you go next?
Sure. I think people need honesty, right? I think the Premier has a great way of kind of spinning things in a way that seems digestible when you're, reasonable. But I think, unfortunately, we're often being misled. So I'm so grateful that Mike Schreiner is really bringing some truths out when he's speaking up. We're often asked, I think pretty much every time Ford speaks, Mike Schreiner is there right behind him, kind of giving an anecdotal impact of what that is. So as someone who's deeply connected to our education workers, I want to stay connected to folks who are in the schools, to parents and students, to bring those realities forward, because I think people are so divided, especially related to the media, that they're looking for answers and they don't know what to believe. And so I think showing integrity, being honest, showing up. So, if you call me, if you email me, I will be there. And I hope that all MPPs will be responsive and engaged, and calling on all MPPs to show up, listen, and engage with stakeholders and constituents. So yeah, that's what I hope to do, is bring that integrity forward as an MPP.
I'll be going back into the classroom in September, and but on so many levels, just really encouraging the general public at the same time to stay involved, write letters to the newspaper for those communities that have local newspapers, flood social media with fact. But I too sometimes fall down that trap of responding to people who are just trolls and speaking just complete ignorance. I would always say, do not respond to them and just flood with facts and anecdotes and real life meaning of what's going on with this, with what's going to be happening in the education system. And then I always stay committed to, in social opportunities, having those awkward conversations, if it comes up, of clarifying the record, even with friends, even when I'm playing men's hockey. There are those moments where I could just not say anything, but I do speak up and set the record straight, because there's a lot of ignorance and bias out there when it comes to this subject within education. So those are the things I'm hoping to keep working at and hopefully inspiring others to do as well.
Okay, so another question. How can we engage the electorate more effectively as educators or as politicians, maybe thinking about like low voter turnout, maybe like public apathy in the wake of the Greenbelt scandal, other related scandals, that sort of thing. So I'll pass it to you, Mike.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to be there for people and to walk hand in hand with people. And so, you know, on the $8.3 billion Greenbelt scandal, it's, you know, being there at the rallies, it's being a voice at Queen's Park, it's encouraging and supporting citizens and average folks to help them have a voice and to be able to put pressure on government to do the right things and put what's good for people ahead of a handful of, you know, wealthy elite speculators. Same thing in education is to be there with educators. I've loved some of the suggestions, like, you know, go have a coffee with the custodian or the, you know, special education worker or your child's teacher, and just learn what goes on in our schools, and then be an ally and a voice amplifying and putting pressure on government to do the right thing. And I think sometimes, and I've had a sense of this around the whole Greenbelt scandal, is that sometimes people feel a bit disempowered and overwhelmed. But I want to remind everyone that people power has made a huge difference. And I'm going to give you 3 very concrete examples during my time as an MPP. So when I was first elected, the first fall, Doug Ford actually put forward a bill that would have opened the Greenbelt for development. And people pushed back, they were outraged. And when the legislature reconvened in February after the winter break, the first thing the government did was work to remove that from the bill because the public had put so much pressure on government. And so we can do that again. I know it's tougher this time, but I know we can do it again. When the government put forward a ministerial zoning order to pave over the Duffins Creek wetlands for an Amazon warehouse, people were outraged and spoke out against that. And there were rallies and protests and petitions and all kinds of things. And the government backtracked on that one as well. And then most recently, less than a year ago, the government attacked the charter rights of the lowest paid education workers in our province. And they pushed back, and so many members of the public pushed, and members of provincial parliament like myself all worked together to push back against the government, and they backtracked within a week on that one. And so when it comes to supporting students and educators and making sure our schools have the resources they need, like, speak out, don't like, you know, don't give up is what I want to say. Same thing on the Greenbelt scandal, man. This issue is far from being over. And so, you know, I know in myself, I know in Aislinn, you know, as when she becomes an MPP for Kitchener Centre, like, we are going, and when Matt does for Parry Sound-Muskoka the next election, we are going to be there with you, supporting you, amplifying your voice, And so I just want to say to people, like, engagement, like political engagement, is so vitally important, and especially right now. And so we're there to support you in whatever efforts the public's going to put forward to amplify voice and put pressure on government. Oh, Aislinn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going door to door every day. I hear it. People don't believe in government now because they feel like they've been lied to. So when they meet me, because we Greens believe in going to every door, we listen and we show up. And I think people say, oh, wow, you're not. I tell people, like, if someone else had the keys, go ahead, drive the car. But I feel like I'm on a ride and I want to get off. So people can get a sense of the frustration tolerance. People want to quit because they can't handle the kind of deception and policy and the way they've been lied to. So I think people see that Greens have integrity. We show up, we work hard, we listen, and we are honest, even when it's uncomfortable and we disagree with somebody. I'm happy to tell people, like, I'm sorry, I do disagree with you. But I'm going to be honest with you. So I think that's what we see here in Kitchener Center. We have a Green MP, and they see the difference of somebody who returns their phone calls and their emails and is advocating for middle low income folks and vulnerable people, and being an honest voice with integrity. And definitely for Mike Schreiner too, people talk about how they can trust what he says. So I think folks are ready for a change, and I hear that at the door, where folks have said, no, I'm not voting, I haven't voted in a while. We have a minute to connect, and they say, oh, okay, I'll try again, and it renews that hope.
I would re-emphasize everything Aislinn and Mike just said, and I would add, in between elections, and leading up to by-elections, this would be more of a wish list. But the more we can have the general public aware of what provincial politicians do, and that can happen at the door naturally, but it is still, we're far off of our general electorate really understanding what provincial politicians do versus their federal MPs, and the confusion that happens there sometimes, even at municipal level. And I think if people truly understood what the power they have in their vote to their local MPP or to their local candidate, that would inspire more voter turnout. But it seems from one election to the next that people are disillusioned, but they're actually misinformed as well, as to what they think they're voting for or not voting for. And maybe Elections Ontario could step up, but I don't know what kind of budget they have for advertising on that end of things. But as long as what Aislinn and Mike have been saying, the Green Party puts forward such a fresh approach to doing politics that resonates with everyone. And we saw it up here in Parry Sound-Muskoka last year. We had just over 40% of the vote, and I would say each vote was an authentic vote. And I think the reason a lot of people didn't turn up was because their party, they were just fed up with their party, and we're slowly building that base of more green. And I would always say that the way to bring more voter turnout with the way we do politics is keep doing what we're doing, real life engagement and listening, collaborating, and building up that base from one election to the next.
Hey, we have lots of great questions in the chats, but I know we're pressed for time, and some of us have commitments that we have to get to. So I will give it to you, Mike, to thank everyone, say goodbye, and then maybe I can work with the three of you on putting together a video answering some of the questions that we didn't get to today.
Yeah, well, just thanks everyone for joining us today. Sorry about my technical difficulties there at the beginning. And I just want to say that it is just so vitally important that people stay politically engaged right now and can continue to put pressure on this government, and whether it's fighting back to protect the greenbelt and our farmland, our forests and wetlands, pushing back to protect our healthcare system and ensure people have access to the care they need, and pushing back and pushing hard for support for our schools, educators, students, and families. Education is just so vitally important to the present and future of our province. And our children right now deserve a government who's going to invest in them and invest in the people who teach them and care for them in our schools. And so I just want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation today, because it's so important.
Thanks everyone for coming. Stay in touch.
Thank you.